the development of renewable energy projects, how that may cause delays or things of that nature. We also want to talk about how the current climate is impacting the financing of renewable energy projects. How is this presenting risks or opportunities for parties looking to procure renewable energy today? And then lastly, we want to share thoughts about how to prepare for this period, whether you're approaching procuring renewables or whether you currently have renewables under contract. What are some of the areas of focus that would be prudent to incorporate as you continue down your journey? So with that agenda covered, I'm going to dive in a little bit into the high-level executive summary, I'd call it, of our main points that we'll discuss today. So from an energy market perspective, we want to look a little bit at some of the drivers. We're looking at demand. We want to understand how electricity and natural gas pricing is reacting to the situation. And I think our high-level takeaway is that at this point, there have been some changes in the energy markets, but it's not been significant to date. It's perhaps a little too early to really see the impacts on commodity prices that are likely to start to fall out from some of the slowdown of production, both in terms of oil and gas drilling as well as load impacting pricing. So far the impacts are fairly minimal. I mean, we're seeing drops in demand somewhere in the high single digits, low double digit percentage wise. And that's creating some, or rather in parallel, we're seeing some changes in pricing, but it's hard to pinpoint whether those are driven purely by COVID-19 or whether those would have been in existence regardless of COVID-19, given other market dynamics that are present right now. As it relates to project development, what we're seeing and what we advise folks to keep an eye on is that from a supply chain perspective, most of the issues that we're seeing are actually domestic issues more so than international. It seems that international supply chains are still moving, perhaps not at pre-COVID-19 levels, but manufacturing in places like China is ramping back up, and most of the holdups that we're seeing are from getting materials and equipment from ports to the project sites, so domestic logistics more so than international shipping. We're also seeing meaningful risks around permitting and approvals associated with projects. And as you'd probably anticipate, some labor issues as well, in particular when multiple groups of more than 10 people need to get together on a site. From a project financing perspective, we are still seeing a number of financing options still available to project developers. The complexion of the options is changing a little bit in that we anticipate lower tax liabilities and therefore lower demand from tax equity investors. Somewhat counterintuitively, although the interest rates are dropping, we are also hearing reports of increased scrutiny on underwriting requirements, and so it's actually been a lot harder for folks to get debt despite the more favorable terms. And from a sponsor equity perspective, I think the jury's still out. There still seems to be capital interested in going in as sponsor equity. However, we may see some of the less credit-worthy developers starting to have more challenges in putting up the sponsor equity. And all of that's going to tie together into a set of sort of tips and guidance that Kevin and I will share at the end of this webinar for C&I buyers that are either approaching procurement or have executed PPAs. So let's dive in. Over the course of the next 50 minutes or so, we'll touch on each of these 4 topics in more depth. So starting with the energy markets. So as a number of you can, or in fact most of you I imagine can anticipate, as all of the shops and restaurants and schools, office buildings have closed down and everybody is shifting to a remote working environment, we're seeing meaningful changes in electricity usage patterns. What we are looking at down in the bottom left corner, I think, is illustrative of how electricity demand has shifted from a pre-COVID-19 to a COVID-19 era. The same week in March in 2019 versus 2020 showed much more peakiness, much bigger spike in demand in the morning, followed by a much bigger proportional dip over the course of the day, followed by, once again, proportionally a bigger spike in the evenings. In addition to that, obviously the demand is a little bit lower than it was this time last year. Note that the y-axis is not to scale, or certainly has been cut off at 22,000 megawatt hours here for PJM. So, proportionally the dip is in total demand is not substantial, but perhaps in the, as I mentioned a few moments ago, high single digits, low double digits. This change in load profile from a peakier to a flatter demand is going to impact prices some, because peakiness drives the highest prices. So as we think about the performance of renewable energy projects, you would expect that the availability of higher priced hours is going to be reduced because of this flatter curve. That's going to impact peaking type facilities most significantly, so natural gas peakers, perhaps storage assets. How it's impacting solar and wind is still somewhat of an open question. We've been running a handful of different analyses to try to determine how wind and solar are being impacted relative to each other during this COVID-19 period. However, the duration of the COVID-19 shutdowns are too short at this point to draw meaningful conclusions. Overall, we do expect prices to decline a little bit, driven by declining loads, and we expect to have fewer high-priced hours that, if a wind or a solar facility were producing during those hours, would result in strong economic opportunity for the wind and solar assets. Shifting our attention here to one of the underlying drivers of wholesale electric pricing, and that's natural gas. What we're seeing is that there's overall a meaningful change in how we expect natural gas pricing to be priced in the markets over the short term, over the next 6 to 10 months or so, followed by a relative return to normal. As we look down this futures curve that looks out about 9 years from today, we see that after the initial period of disruption driven by COVID, in the very beginning of that sort of yellow shaded box, there's obviously a difference in price, and much lower pricing today on the gray line than in 2019, than was anticipated in 2019 for this same time period, as illustrated by the blue line. However, by the end of the year, those prices come back in line. As some of you may be aware, the longer the duration of a forward curve, or rather the further out you go down a forward curve, the lower the confidence interval in the forwards. Therefore, as we look out 2, 3, 4 years from today, we see that forwards are still pretty much in line today as where they would have been if you had pulled forwards a year ago. So all of this is to say that we see a near-term impact with the return to normal once society and business and industry starts to return to normal as well. Now, we all know there's a lot of debate around how long it will be before we return to normal, and I'm not going to try to guess how long that is, but the outlook amongst natural gas traders is that once society returns to normal, we will come back to pricing levels similar to the pre-COVID-19 period. We do see slightly different growth rates anticipated from the same period a year ago than we do today. Really, that's principally driven by the low starting points that we're in right now as a result of COVID, more so than anything happening further out in the curve. One of the questions that we've been contemplating and talking about with industry partners is how changes in oil and natural gas exploration and production activity is going to impact electricity prices. As many of you are aware, oil prices have dropped significantly. As we look back on this graph here at 2019, we can see natural gas prices have declined meaningfully over the course of 2019. So the impact of that is we anticipate less capital being available for E&P activity in the oil and gas sector. We anticipate that fewer wells are going to be economic to drill, therefore reductions in oil and gas drilling activity. And over the more medium term, we should therefore see a decline in the quantity of production and supply for natural gas. As demand starts to, as I mentioned on the prior page, because we're seeing demand a little bit, that declined production from natural gas should equal out with the declined demand, which I think is why in the forwards curve we're seeing a little more parity amongst the prices from a year ago as from today. Continuing to move on, so taking the picture of demand from 2 slides ago and the picture of natural gas pricing from the prior slide, what does that mean in terms of what we're seeing in wholesale electricity prices? So what we're looking at here is how electricity prices in both PJM at West Hub and in New York over the first 3 months of the year differ from the same 3-month period from a year ago. So the black line represents the 2020 pricing, and the orange was 2019. And so what we're seeing is, in particular in PJM, that there's a noticeable decrease in wholesale market pricing. In PJM West, it's a little bit tighter in New York, but certainly as we look out into the March period, we're certainly seeing a separation between those lines. I think that in both markets, it's interesting to observe that we're not seeing a meaningful divergence of these 2 lines as of March, when a number of the stay-at-home orders have been put in place. What we sort of conclude from that is that it's hard to pinpoint the impact of COVID-19 exclusively as being the driver of declining prices relative to a year ago. If we layer in a line from 2016, which was a mild winter year, similar to the winter that we've had here in 2020, actually the pricings are more in line, and in particular that I think that shows over the course of March in PJM and more consistently since the beginning of the year in New York. So what we take away from this is that a good amount of the price decreases may well be driven by the warmer climate that we've had this winter versus the winter of 2019. We also have to keep in mind the natural gas price declines that I spoke about on the prior page, also being a contributing factor. So all of this is to say that so far it's been hard to isolate or pinpoint COVID in particular as being a driver of price declines. Okay, with that, that sort of wraps up our discussion as it relates to how we have seen COVID impacting the energy markets, both from a demand, natural gas, and wholesale electricity market perspective. To sort of summarize what that means for renewable energy projects, any projects that are in operation right now are likely experiencing lower pricing and perhaps therefore worse economic performance. Is that driven due to COVID? It doesn't seem to be exclusively driven by COVID. It seems that weather and natural gas pricing is just as much a driver for those lower performances. Conversely, if you're anticipating contracting with a renewable energy asset or intend to in the future, the futures curve are pretty much in line with what they were a year ago. So taking a long-term perspective on these transactions suggests that the market hasn't fundamentally moved to what it was before, and we should anticipate that any impacts that we're experiencing today in declined pricing is temporary, be that driven by climate, natural gas pricing, or COVID. So our long-term perspective is that the fundamentals of wholesale pricing is still in the same line as it was before this crisis began. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kevin, who's going to talk to us about the impacts on projects development and financing. Kevin, over to you.
Families are doing as well as can be in this pretty extraordinary time we're living through right now. So what we're going to do here is sort of walk through the major categories of that can be impacted on projects. I think one of the obvious ones, which you've probably heard something about, is just in general on permits and approvals of various kinds. A lot of government agencies are either shut down entirely or at least working at a much slower pace to the degree that they can work remotely. A lot of these projects are permitted in very rural areas down at the county and township level. That can be fairly complicated to get to do remotely. So, and then there's a lot of other kind of land rights holders involved in these deals, landowners, for instance. So if you have a project that's relatively advanced and you're going to be going into construction, hopefully you've finalized your financing if you have a 2020 project, but if not, if you're trying to get last minute things like estoppels from the landowners and other rights holders, that kind of thing can also get slowed down. And normally that would not be a big holdup for a project, but today that can be. Projects that are further out, 21 and later, may not have that kind of issue, but there can be others, particularly for 21 projects, getting through. There's a lot of approvals happening around now, interconnection agreements, could be financing as well. So those can get slowed down. On supply chain, the international supply chain seems to be mitigating a bit in terms of delays that we would have seen a few weeks ago or expected a few weeks ago. A lot of the supply chain, a substantial amount of supply chain is based in China. Manufacturing is ramping back up there, and that seems to be less likely to cause. Local domestic logistics, though, that's growing in an area of concern. So in a whole variety of ways, transportation, final manufacturing, et cetera. Labor challenges. Finding labor has been difficult anyway in the recent environment, finding experienced people. Even before this all hit. And now you've got rules against people working in groups, or at least in larger groups, which will really complicate the work on some of these projects. And then for projects that are actually in construction or going into construction, if you have outbreaks at the site, that even if you have local rules that allow you to proceed or procedures that allow you to go ahead, then there's obviously the potential for local outbreaks and direct impacts from that. Go ahead and flip forward, Terence. So put a couple of these looking specifically at two categories, I guess two buckets of projects. First, in those approaching procurement, maybe you don't have a PPA signed, you're negotiating, or maybe even working on a term sheet. And then if you have a signed PPA. So if you're approaching procurement, for pricing, we're certainly seeing that there's not much that's really pushing prices down here. So more likely, what we are seeing are some increases. Some of it's coming from financing costs going up more than expected, supply shortages, some labor issues, shortages as well. Foreign exchange, a stronger U.S. dollar, depending on how the contract was denominated, and if you're supplying from overseas, then that could be a big issue for some folks as well. For COD, projects can get pushed out certainly from a variety of these delays. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If the IRS doesn't clarify the tax qualification rule, in other words, give some more grace for these tax credit deadlines that are approaching, or if Congress doesn't pass extensions, then we've got big issues to look at there. On finance, in general, we've got availability of finance, but I think the full impacts haven't really been seen here yet, particularly for non-balance sheet players who don't sort of have an established cadre, either providing tax equity themselves or an established group that they work with on tax equity. We do expect tax equity to be harder to find, although I think we'll find later on that it hasn't fully expressed itself yet, but we are expecting that. If you have a signed PPA, then you've got to worry about, but not before, but it's still before commercial operation. Then you've got delays in equipment supply, but as I said, that's moderating because China is resuming exports. But once it gets here in the U.S., then we're seeing additional problems. There's force majeure notices going out pretty frequently by developers. Not necessarily declarations in large numbers yet, but that's anticipated. If force majeure is sort of acceptable, in the specific terms of the contract, then the developer will have extended time frame. But if IRS or Congress doesn't act, then they might miss tax credits. And in that case, if that happens, then we have potential defaults or certainly damages that could ensue from that. Permitting challenges. I think if you have, for instance, an outage to interconnect your project later this year, that could be in some danger. Obviously, the later it is in the year, the better. But all of these little pieces are just harder with most people on a work-from-home policy. Next. It's a little bit here on the sort of differential impacts for wind and for solar, which are certainly not the only, but the two dominant sources that we work with anyway. You can see on the left you have solar, on the right there's wind. They're pretty similar in the front in terms of what the trade associations, SEIA for solar, AWEA for wind, that they're working on. Interestingly, the amount of megawatts or gigawatts in this case identified as wind at risk by wind at risk and being at risk are a lot larger than solar. Part of that, a lot of that is just due to the tax credits that are ramping down earlier for wind than for solar. In terms of the global supply chain impacts, generally impacts solar a bit more heavily. The wind supply chain is a bit more diversified, with some exceptions. For instance, GE is getting a lot of its turbines from China. So, but there are other components other than the turbines themselves are still coming from a number of other locations, and then there's EU suppliers as well there. In Asia, there are quite a few, for solar, there's quite a few suppliers in other parts of Asia. Unfortunately, they are behind China in terms of their impact. So they may be more impacted over the coming weeks than China has been. So in terms of potential delays, I think we've talked a little bit here about tax credits, but for solar, you've got the potential if you have if you've put in a purchase order for panels but can't receive them within 3.5 months, which is the period that the IRS requires for what they call delivery, then you've got an issue here with loss of at least partial ITC for that. So solar's in a much better position here in terms of losing the window, but there is this specific issue the broader window for the ITC, but there's this specific issue for this 3.5-month delivery period. For wind, I'd say the stakes are higher. You've got 2020 projects that need to be complete by the end of this year. If they were qualified in 2016 for the 100% PTC, so it remains to be seen whether the IRS is going to provide an additional grace period, or if Congress is going to extend. We're hopeful that's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay, I think we'll skip to the next slide here. Now we're going to talk a little bit about financing requirements or considerations here. I think we're missing part of this page. Yeah, so we're going to look at this in 3 main buckets: sponsor equity, tax equity, and debt. So starting with sponsor equity, for non-balance sheet players, there's certainly liquidity constraints for those who aren't fully capitalized or relying on other parties. So there can be challenges in finding capital or closing on capital to be able to fund activities. For balance sheet players, less of a concern, but depending on how they're structuring the project, if they have partners or whatever, that can still be a factor. In terms of tax equity, we are seeing an expectation of shrinking tax liabilities because of what's happening with the economy, of course. That should reduce tax equity impact or tax equity appetite pretty substantially, well with a number of players. But interestingly, we haven't really seen that, at least among the major providers to date. So we'll check back on that in a few weeks and see if that's still the case. And again, this whole issue with potential for missed tax deadlines, particularly for wind, is a very significant one. So if you're not fully don't have it fully committed in writing, then that could create some issues. On the debt side, as Terence mentioned earlier, there's a lot of liquidity. There's a lot of money. The money supply is supposedly very easy from the Fed system, and then interest rates have at least nominally gone down, but that hasn't necessarily turned into cheaper debt for folks, at least across some of the folks that we've talked to. I think the tightened underwriting criteria. We've heard from some folks who've seen financing costs for projects they're trying to close on jump by 75 basis points just in the last few weeks. And just the supply just getting tighter, willingness to lend, I guess. People are getting nervous about credit quality, about all the issues here. So I think it's just slowing things down in general. So that's obviously remains a source of concern. In terms of the overall impacts, we see, I think, in the sponsor equity side, it's really hard to predict, frankly. It's again beginning. I think the risk picture is just looking very different. So again, if you haven't closed on some funding, this could be fairly complicated. There does seem to be, still supply out there. So we'll have to see what that the impact is there on cost and availability. For tax equity, we believe it's going to become less available, even if it hasn't shown up in great detail yet. There's certainly a chance that would also get costlier. Fewer players in the market, you would think sort of there'd be a flight to quality. Might be harder for some of the more marginal or smaller players to get access, and particularly to get access at what have been recent costs anyway. On the debt side, as I mentioned earlier, we're thinking it either is going to be tougher to get or possibly even a little more expensive if you haven't closed on something. Okay, next. Slightly different picture here and subject. So we're expecting this kind of a market to create some consolidation. So I know that there are players out there looking to acquire from distressed developers or distressed assets. I don't know if there are that many that are that distressed yet, so we expect this to happen depending on how things play out over the coming, certainly weeks or months or two. There's not a lot of evidence of this yet, I would say, but I'm sure it's happening in the market in various places, just hasn't become very visible yet. Again, tax credit, the big question is whether Congress will act. We're hopeful about that. IRS, I haven't heard anything new about this, but there's some hope that IRS will allow some additional grace here. And then an interesting point just on ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance, stock portfolios, which include renewables, for instance, that are environmentally beneficial kinds of investments. They're actually doing pretty well in this market, or that's probably the wrong way to put it. They are not taking as big a hit as a lot of other parts of the market. So it seems to be a more stabilizing influence to have this renewables investments and companies in your portfolios. Next. Okay. So I think we're going to talk a little bit here. This brings us to tips for C&I buyers to help them navigate what the coming period here and the uncertainty that comes along with that. So again, sticking to the approach of talking about procurement before, so you don't have a PPA yet. And as Terence mentioned earlier, as far as thinking about energy markets, we think keeping a long-term perspective makes sense. There are some near-term wholesale market declines that are expected, haven't fully been as big as we might have thought before. Futures haven't been significantly affected yet, and if this moves quickly, then they may not be. For retail purchases, this is a very good time if you can recontract for retail electric or natural gas contracts. You can add or extend hedges if you are not on a fully fixed type contract. this is a good time to do that. Hedges are a good value right now. And by that, I'm really talking about blocks for electric purchases, principally. On project delays, you really want to look at mature projects, particularly those with interconnect agreements. That's easier said than done, since a lot of those have come off the board and already been contracted. Deep diligence on timing, really looking at the project development plan, milestones. Make some conservative timing assumptions. Don't necessarily assume everything's going to stay on schedule, even if it's already taken some of that into account. Mitigating risk through contracts. So you want to reduce your exposure to the missed tax credit. Again, easier said than done, but you want to try and push as much of that on the developer as possible, and require status updates frequently. Look closely at your force majeure definitions if you have a chance to narrow them a bit, or at least cap the amount of the time period that force majeure can extend for. This will be quite a discussion with the developer, I'm sure, but it's something you want to be cognizant of, so it can't necessarily go on forever. And we don't want to be unreasonable here, because this is a circumstance where some patience is appropriate, and so we want to encourage people to do that. Where you don't have a hard deadline you have to get to, and there isn't a tax credit at stake, then it certainly makes sense to have some flexibility there. So you want to look at status of what materials they've actually bought, where it is, statistics for specialized equipment, particularly for wind. Is labor really all available or not? What's the status of those commitments? On project financing, you want to take a very close look at the counterparty credit, obviously, particularly just on the ability to finance and get to financial close on a reasonable timetable. And then for COD timing, as I said earlier, what you want to do is tie your commitment to the financial close, if you can do that in the contract, so that if they don't get there, you have the opportunity to exit. Again, being reasonable here, because this is an extraordinary period. You want to make sure you don't lose a good project if you can afford to be flexible. Okay, and then I'll turn this over back to Terence to talk about once you have an executed PPA.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so just to pick up the same three themes that Kevin touched on around thinking about the energy markets and therefore the project's performance. Secondly, thinking about project development and ensuring that the project's continuing to stay on pace. And lastly, from a financing perspective, but this time all through the lens of an organization that has executed renewable energy contracts. And some of these comments relate to whether your asset is pre-COD, others relate to whether it's post-COD. So the first comment, this certainly echoes something Kevin mentioned a moment ago, but we see this as a particularly good opportunity to think about how to really complement your renewable energy asset with a strong retail purchase, given that both electricity and natural gas are at particularly low prices right now. We believe that this is a good time to focus on recontracting or extending contracts for electricity and natural gas. To the extent that you're concerned about the performance of your renewable energy asset because of declined wholesale market prices, if you take this opportunity to secure a retail electric contract at these lower pricing levels today and secure that contract on an index basis, then you buy in a cheap hedge against the renewable asset. So although the financial performance of the renewable asset may be depressed, your brown power purchases or your retail energy purchases are also depressed. And so when thinking about your energy portfolio or the performance of your energy procurements on a portfolio basis, taking sort of a holistic view, you can nullify some of the downside on the renewable asset by making smart, strategic recontracting decisions today on the retail side. Shifting down to the project development side of things, so we think it's very important at this point, if you have a PPA, to review the provisions that relates to delays and force majeure, and in particular to understand which of those provisions will permit an excused delay on the part of the developer versus instances where delay damages may be owing, and making sure that you're keeping track of when those triggers may occur and when you may be able to collect delay damages from the developer. At the same time, really understanding the force majeure provisions well. There's a lot of ongoing debate right now about whether this pandemic constitutes a force majeure event, in particular for contracts that haven't explicitly listed pandemic as a force majeure event. So it's important to spend some time reviewing those provisions and understanding, first of all, whether this event qualifies or not. But secondly, if it does qualify, then understanding what the sort of excused duration that the developer has whilst force majeure is in effect. Moving down, beyond the contractual side of things, from more of a continued project development point of view, we think it's very important to stay on top of the progress with permits and approvals. So we'd advise sort of greater attention and frequency of discussions with the developers to ensure that the milestones they've laid out are still on track, and if not, understanding what the revised forecasts look like. So I think that sort of feeds in a little bit to the next point, which is around requesting frequent updates from the developers. We think the sooner you are aware or up to speed about prospective delays in the development schedule, the better. The more either you can adjust whatever plans and preparations for implementation that are needed on your side, as well as the more time it gives you to evaluate mitigation options that you have. Another piece that hasn't really gotten much attention yet relates to O&M, operations and maintenance. So for assets that have already achieved COD, we think it's important to check in with the asset owner on the status of O&M. Is the asset owner still planning to continue to have the same frequency of physical on-site maintenance checks as they did before? How about the remote monitoring systems that keep track and operate the plants remotely? Given the virtual work arrangements many folks are in, there are questions about the continuity of those. So we think it's important to get in touch with asset owners and ask about their contingency and continuity plans for both on-site physical O&M as well as the remote monitoring facilities. Then the last point we want to touch on relates to project financing and wanting to ensure that your counterparty, your developer, is indeed getting funded as expected. So at times the contract execution of your supply contract may have happened before full funding of the project, and so staying in regular touch with the developer or asset owner to understand the status of their funding. As Kevin mentioned a few minutes ago, we've heard of developers having increases in their debt costs over the past couple of weeks as they're leading up to reaching financial close. So you want to make sure that you're keeping abreast of when funding events occur, and if they're getting delayed, what the timeline looks like, and what some of the hurdles are that may be arising on that front. So regular contact with the developer around funding plans is really important. So with that, I think that wraps up our review of the impacts of COVID-19 on the renewable energy landscape, in particular through the lens of a C&I buyer. I understand that we have a handful of questions. Maggie, maybe I'll turn it over to you to direct us on the questions.
Thank you very much, Terence and Kevin. If you can turn to the next slide, please. Now we will go ahead and take some time for questions right now. And just a reminder, please be sure to send your questions through the live chat function. You can find that either on the top of your screen or at the bottom of your screen. And we will be starting the questions we received from the registration form first. Thank you for everyone for sending those questions. And Kevin and Terence, there are a couple questions from the demand side. Both Daniel and Benjamin asked, how is COVID-19 impacting the 100% renewable energy or sustainability goals for corporates and other non-traditional off-takers? Terence and Kevin?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. What we've seen actually is very encouraging among our clients. We've seen just great continuity and momentum, and we've seen very little. We have had a couple of clients who hit the pause button but want to come back to this before very long, and we've had some new folks sign up. And we haven't heard a lot about the folks that have public goals, sustainability goals, carbon reduction goals out there that are at least those that are relatively nearer term. We haven't seen much at all of a decline. Again, as I said earlier, some of these impacts, maybe we're just a little too early to really have seen them yet. But I'd say the signs are very encouraging so far.
I would add to what Kevin just said that, I think where we are seeing impacts, it's more sectorally specific. And so certain industries that are most on the front lines of battling the COVID-19 crisis are perhaps the ones most prone to hitting the pause button or, having more immediate, urgent imperatives that they need to focus their attention on. But outside of the sectors, and I'm thinking of healthcare as one obviously that comes to mind, outside of those sectors, as Kevin mentioned, it seems to have not dented the intent to move forward. I think a number of organizations and a number of people we've been in touch with sort of see certain parallels between the health of the planet and climate change and the COVID-19 public health crisis that we're seeing. And so I think that we see a continued commitment, if not perhaps even an accentuated commitment to the need to be sustainably minded and take good care of our planet and our people. Seems to be a sort of common thread that are hearing amongst certain clients. So, lots of continued interest in pursuing more renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Terence and Kevin. It's to hear that there's continued commitment despite this uncertainty. And another question we received from Audrey, is the renewable market better or worse due to COVID-19 and the falling crude oil prices?
Yeah, maybe I can just take that one, as it speaks a little bit to one of the slides I spoke about earlier. So, as you're aware, the Saudi and Russian oil war of the past several weeks and months has certainly led to declining oil prices. That has followed a not too dissimilar trajectory to how natural gas prices have declined over the past year. And I think the net effect of that is sort of twofold. On the one hand, it is related, or perhaps one influencing factor, in lower electric wholesale prices. On the other hand, it's also reducing the amount of E&P activity in terms of oil and gas drilling, and therefore we do anticipate that when we take a slightly longer term perspective on this event, we will see a decline in the quantity of production of natural gas, in particular in this country, and how that impacts natural gas prices and therefore electricity prices really comes down to whether the demand for natural gas returns to pre-COVID-19 levels. If it does, and we have that scenario coupled with a lower production across the country, then we should see natural gas prices start to rise, and therefore electricity prices start to rise.
Thank you, Terence. Kevin, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome. And just to keep an eye to the clock right now, we will be taking the last question. There is a question from viewer. Have you heard of any new contract models to shift risk away from the off-taker? Related, have you heard of some off-takers being taken off guard by terms in PPAs that meant they were taking more risk than they thought?
Well, I certainly think the sort of conventional PPAs, VPPAs, or virtual PPAs, without any bells and whistles, can entail a fair amount of risk. I think there's been found, at least under some conditions, but there have been a lot of developments in the last couple of years with new products to mitigate that. So we certainly think that's beginning to happen, either through the developer who is able to get certain kinds of hedges, or through the off-taker themselves going to the market, some new insurance products that allow them to limit the downside risk. There's also a lot of efforts, or I guess new products, that allow a risk sharing with the developer. So essentially provides some additional upside for the developer in return for a lower PPA price for the off-taker, sometimes much lower, depending on how that's structured and what the forward markets look like in a particular area. So there's a lot of evolution. Some of them are relatively new, so there's not a lot of experience at this point, or not a lot of transactions with them. But it looks like it's going to become, much more common. So
I would add. So what Kevin just described are some of the sort of risk mitigating products or terms that can be rolled into or rolled on top of wholesale energy transactions. I think beyond wholesale energy transactions, there are a handful of opportunities at a retail level, and I think not for everybody, because it depends on where you are located geographically. And so I think it's really important for organizations to have a really good strategy on what the right type of transaction structure is for them, because a number of these retail level transactions, whether those are, community solar type transactions, whether they're structured retail, so sort of long-term renewable energy retail contracts, those transaction structures present a very different and I'd say reduced risk profile relative to a wholesale market transaction. And so understanding what those options are is really important for organizations to understand what their alternatives are to reduce their risks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kevin and Terence. And since we're at 2 o'clock right now, I just want to thanks to Terence and Kevin for joining us and all the participants for joining us today. Just a reminder, we have several sessions coming up in the RE Connect webinar series, so stay tuned and please check our official website for more details. Thank you everyone again for joining us today. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent to all the participants, and you can find it on our official website as well. Hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and we will see you next time. Thank you.